my colleagues here in the Senate to urge in the strongest possible terms that the Republican leadership here accept its responsibility and not allow the government of the United States of America to shut down. Republicans control the U.S. Senate, they control the U.S. House, and a Republican is in the White House. Please do not shut the government down. A government shutdown will be extremely distressing and difficult for millions of people in every state in our country who utilize government services. A government shutdown will be extremely painful for millions of federal employees who depend upon their paychecks to provide for their families. And a government shutdown will make it much more difficult for the United States military, the men and women who are putting their lives on the line to defend us, to do their jobs. The American people do not want a government shutdown. I do not want a government shutdown, and I believe that most of my Republican colleagues do not want a government shutdown. And it is imperative that President Trump understands, despite what he said in May, that statement is wrong. When he said our country needs a good shutdown, that is wrong. Our country does not need a good shutdown. What we need is an annual budget that addresses the many needs of the American people. Just last night, Mr. President, this is what a spokesperson from the Pentagon stated, and I quote, "We have been working under a continuing resolution for 3 years now. Our current CR expires tomorrow, January 19th. This is wasteful and destructive. We need a fully funded fiscal year 18 budget or face ramifications on our military," end of quote. This afternoon, I say to Senator McConnell, the Republican leader here in the Senate, please do not shut the government down. You know, Senator McConnell, the political reality as well as anybody in our country. In the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass this budget agreement. You don't have 60 votes. Please sit down with Democrats and start negotiating in good faith. Please do not shut the government down. More and more Democrats are sick and tired of kicking the can down the road, tired of us not addressing the major crises facing this country, tired of running a $4 trillion operation, which is what the United States government is, on a month-to-month basis. But it's not just Democrats who are demanding that we finally have an annual budget. It is Republicans as well. My understanding is, what I have heard from the news media, is that there are now 5 Republicans prepared to vote against this continuing resolution, and even more who have voiced deep concerns about the lack of an annual budget. They know, and I know, that just passing another temporary budget is totally irresponsible and is abdicating the job that we were elected to do. What the American people understand, what every business person in this country understands, what every family in America understands, is that you cannot run a government given the many, many crises that we face on a month-to-month basis. We cannot continue to abdicate our responsibility. Finally, we must address the problems facing the American people. Last night, the Pentagon told us correctly, and I state again, this is what they said, quote, "We need a fully funded fiscal year 18 budget or face ramifications on our military," end quote. But it is not just the military that faces a crisis situation because of the lack of an annual budget. And let us not forget, we are 3.5 months into the fiscal year. 3.5 months have come and gone. And the Republican leadership here has still not given us an annual budget. But again, it is not just the military that is facing a crisis situation. Mr. President, today, 27 million Americans get their primary health care, dental care, mental health counseling, and low-cost prescription drugs through the Community Health Center program. In my state of Vermont, 1 out of 4 Vermonters get their primary health care through community health centers. 3.5 months have gone since the beginning of this fiscal year, and the Republicans have not yet reauthorized funding for the Community Health Center program, which is now facing a severe crisis in terms of recruiting and retaining the doctors, nurses, and other medical staff they need to maintain the quality of service they must maintain. What doctor, what nurse is going to come to a community health center when he or she doesn't even know if that facility is going to receive funding? 27 million Americans depend upon community health centers. Now, I'm glad that, as I understand it, the Republicans now are prepared to reauthorize the CHIP program. 9 million kids need that program. 3.5 months come and gone. Finally, they're talking about reauthorizing CHIP. That's good. But you cannot forget community health centers. Mr. President, the Community Health Center program in this country is 50 years old. It was developed in the 1960s. It is supported by virtually every Democrat, and I think the vast majority of the Republicans. And yet it has not been reauthorized. This is a crisis which cannot be kicked down the road. It has to be addressed, and addressed now. Mr. President, on Veterans Day, everybody here goes running all over the country giving great speeches about how much we love the veterans. But the Veterans Administration cannot continue to provide decent and quality care to those of our veterans who put their lives on the line to defend us when they have over 30,000 vacancies. In Vermont and around the country, VA provides good quality care. But you can't provide care in a timely manner when we have 30,000 vacancies at the VA. This is an issue that cannot be kicked down. The can cannot be kicked down the road. It must be addressed now, not next year. Mr. President, as everybody knows, Louisiana and Vermont, all over this country, there is a horrible, horrific opioid and heroin epidemic sweeping this country. It has hit my state of Vermont hard. It has hit states all over America. Last year, 60,000 people in our country died as a result of opioid or heroin overdoses. We need to help state governments, local communities, families, police departments address the opioid and heroin epidemic. This is a crisis which cannot be kicked down the road. It must be addressed now. not through a continuing resolution which absolutely ignores this crisis. Must be addressed now. Mr. President, last year, unbelievably, some 10,000 people with disabilities died while awaiting a decision for the applications they made to the Social Security Administration for disability benefits to be approved. People with disabilities apply for benefits. They wait, and they wait. Last year, 10,000 people died with disabilities waiting for a decision. And many of them died because the Social Security Administration is today grossly underfunded, understaffed, and simply not able to deal with the volume of claims that they received. But it is not just people with disabilities. In my state of Vermont, I hear this every day. There are older Americans who are not getting the quality of service they need from the Social Security Administration. Our job is to adequately fund the Social Security Administration so they can protect the needs of senior citizens and people with disabilities in our country. This is a crisis which cannot be kicked down the road. It has to be addressed now, and this continuing resolution that I presume we're going to vote on later today does not deal with it. Mr. President, 1.5 million Americans are in danger of seeing their pensions cut by up to 60%. These are truck drivers, construction workers, machinists, and others who have worked their entire careers with the expectation that they would receive a decent pension when they retired. We have a responsibility to protect the pensions of these hardworking Americans and keep the promises that were made to them. This is another crisis that cannot be kicked down the road. It has to be addressed now, and the continuing resolution that's going to come before us has not one word to say about that. And then we have a child care crisis in this country. Millions of working families can't find quality, affordable child care. We have a student debt crisis in this country, 40 million people, many of them deeply in debt, unable to get on with their lives for the crime of having gone to college. That is a crisis that we have to deal with. We have an infrastructure crisis in this country all over America. Roads, bridges, water system, wastewater plants are collapsing. How do we continue to ignore those crises? Mr. President, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, when the rich are getting richer and everybody else is getting poorer, our job here in Congress is not just to give tax breaks to billionaires. Our job is not just to try to throw 32 million Americans off of the health insurance they have, or to deny the reality of climate change, or to end net neutrality, or make racist comments about countries throughout the world. Our job is to represent the needs of ordinary Americans. We cannot continue to ignore these problems. We cannot continue to kick the can down the road. So once again, I say to the Majority Leader, let us begin to negotiate in good faith. Let us reach decisions which will improve life for the American people, not simply ignore their needs. And Mr. President, when we talk about the crises facing this country, we are also talking about a crisis precipitated by President Trump in September of last year. As a result of President Trump's rescinding President Obama's executive order on DACA, some 800,000 young people in our country are today living in fear, uncertainty, and anxiety. If we do not act and act now, it is possible that many of these young people will lose their legal status and be subjected to the possibility of deportation. This must not be allowed to happen. This issue, to my mind, Mr. President, is one of the great moral issues of our time. These young people who were brought into this country, sometimes at 2 years of age, 3 years, 5 years of age, are people who have lived virtually their entire lives in the United States of America. They are working. They are in school. They are in the military. 20,000 of these young DACA people are now teaching in schools throughout the country. It would be one of the cruelest acts in modern American history, or history in general, our history in general, if we said to these young people who know no other country but the United States of America that they could be deported from our shores. It would be an unspeakable crime, and we must not allow that to happen. But that is not just the opinion of Senator Bernie Sanders. That is the overwhelming point of view of the American people, of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. A poll just came out last night, Mr. President, from CBS. And what the poll showed is that 87% of the American people believe that we should protect the legal status of the Dreamers. 87%. And that poll is consistent with poll after poll after poll, where the people of the United States across the political spectrum are saying we cannot turn our backs on these Dreamers, and the vast majority of people believe we must provide a path toward citizenship. There is now bipartisan legislation that has been written by Senator Durbin, Senator Graham, and others. And I say to Senator McConnell, if 87% of the American people think we should provide legal status to the Dreamers, let us do our job. Let us pass this legislation. This is not a profile in courage. This is what the American people want, and let us do what the American people want. Mr. President, as you well know, terrible, terrible hurricanes struck Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands months and months ago, and people there are still suffering. Many people in Puerto Rico today still do not have electricity. And then there are devastating wildfires and mudslides that have taken place in California. How long does it take for this Congress to respond to the crises facing our fellow Americans? So, Mr. President, what I say is we were elected to do our jobs in representing the American people. That's what we're paid to do. We cannot run a government on a month-to-month basis. Senator McConnell does not have the 60 votes he needs, and now is the time for him to sit down with the Democratic leadership and negotiate a serious agreement on the budget situation, on parity between defense and non-defense spending, negotiate a serious agreement on DACA, providing legal status and a path towards citizenship for our 800,000 young people, negotiate a serious agreement on disaster relief. And the truth of the matter is, we can do it. We can do it. The differences of opinion are not that wide. But we cannot do it and will not do it unless we finally sit down and start negotiating in a serious manner. And that is what I implore